My name is James Gops, and I'm a tax partner at Gately PLC, and I'm going to take the next few minutes just to talk to you about the probable changes that will occur on VAT and Customs duties as a result of Brexit, in particular having a look at no-deal Brexit. Now, it should be said straight away that the position is in a state of flux, and we're not entirely sure where we will end up. However, government has produced some guidance, albeit possibly rather thin in our view, but it has produced guidance, and it effectively breaks the position down into three periods. The first is the extension period up to the 31st of January, then the transitional period if we have a deal with the EU, and then the periods if on exit date on the 31st of January we haven't reached a withdrawal agreement and we, as they say, crash out of the European Union. So if we look at the period between the 31st of October and 31st of January, you will be already aware that the EU has agreed to extend our period of membership of the European Union to the 31st of January, or if a withdrawal agreement can be agreed between now and then, the earlier date. During this extended period, the important point is that we remain a member of the European Union, and therefore the VAT and Customs rules for UK-EU transactions remain exactly as they are now. If we exit the European Union with a deal, the position is as follows. The EU is likely to agree a transitional period under the terms of the withdrawal agreement. The period of the transitional period is not entirely certain. We have always understood it to be 2 years, but the EU has indicated that it might be as long as 3 years. And during the transitional period, the UK would be treated as if it were a member state of the EU and also a member of the Customs Union. Consequently, the same VAT and Customs laws and procedures would apply to all UK and EU transactions, and EU law would continue to apply to the UK. So, for instance, not only VAT and Customs legislation would apply, but also certain direct tax legislation such as the EU Interest and Royalties Directive, and also the Parent Subsidiary Directive would continue, and these are important, as we'll come on to in a little while, with regard to the withholding tax obligations on dividend savings and intellectual property. Once the EU and the UK agreed the new trade and other agreements, the transitional period would come to an end, and the VAT, Customs and tax relationship between the UK and the EU would be dictated by the new UK-EU free trade agreement. But what would happen in the circumstances where we do not achieve a deal by the 31st of January and no further extension is granted? Well, in effect, on the 1st of February 2020, we would have reached the cliff edge, the transitional period would come to an end, and the UK would leave the EU. This is referred to as exit day. The effect of that would be, by virtue of the European Union Withdrawal Act 2018, that all EU law that applies in the UK would become UK law as if a snapshot of that law had been taken on exit day. So any provision in a regulation or a directive, for instance, that impacted and was law in the UK by virtue of our membership of the EU would become part of UK legislation as if it had been enacted by Parliament itself. But of course the UK would no longer be a union member, and it would not be a member of the single market or the customs union, and consequently the UK-EU relationship would be as if the UK were a non-EEA state. Unfortunately, at that point, we wouldn't have agreed the free trade agreement, so it wouldn't be as if we were in the shoes of another non-EEA state, such as Australia or the United States of America. Our trading relationship would be dictated by the WTO rules and schedules, because these would set the baseline for our access and the EU's access to the EU and, in the EU's case, the UK markets. The exemption from withholding tax on interest, royalties, savings and dividends under the royalties and parent subsidiary directives previously referred to would at that point come to an end as well. So turning to a no-deal Brexit, what of VAT? Well, under the snapshot, the UK VAT law will remain very similar to that which we have now, but there are some changes. And these are highlighted by HMRC's guidance, but as has been said before, the guidance is somewhat thin. Goods from the EU would be treated as an import, and VAT on imports would therefore need to be paid by the UK recipient. However, one important change has taken place, in that we don't have to now account for VAT at the border, but can do so at the factory door of our own VAT return. And indeed, this is going to be a change that will apply not only to supplies from the EU, but also supplies from non-EU countries, and that's to be a simplification that is welcomed. Supplies from the UK to the EU of goods would be treated as an export, and under UK law, the exporter would zero rate the VAT. Under current EU rules, VAT would be paid in the member state, but would be paid by the recipient. There would be no EC sales list to complete for the UK supplier, but the UK supplier would be advised to retain evidence of exporting in some other manner. If you have goods in storage in the EU, for instance, you have a depot in Stuttgart, the UK business would be treated as a non-EEA member, but must register for VAT in the member state where the sales are made. So a UK business with that depot in Stuttgart supplying to Luxembourg, France, and Belgium and Germany will have to register for VAT in each of those member states. The supply of services, both to and from the EU, the VAT rules should remain the same, although in terms of services to EU customers, in terms of digital services supplied to non-business consumers, the guidance states that it's going to be necessary for the supplier to register in every member state, since the mini one-stop shop non-union scheme will not be available to UK businesses until after exit date, and that's because until after exit date the EU it continues to be a member state. Services from the EU, the VAT rules should remain the same. Services generally, the key is to understand the place of supply rules. The general rule is that a supply to EU businesses is where the recipient belongs. So a supply to a German business will be treated as supplied over in Germany, not in the UK. Conversely, an EU consumer where it will be where the supplier belongs. So there are several exceptions to this in the UK legislation, and it may be that the legislation will require suppliers to register in more than one state. Advice will need to be taken. To give you an example of some of the complexity that it throws up, if one were to transport a horse from Germany, purchased by a UK consumer for her personal use, and that transport to go from Germany through Holland and Belgium and thence to the UK, it seems likely that whereas now the VAT would be charged just in Germany, the transporter may have to account for and charge VAT not only in Germany but also in Holland and Belgium in proportion to the distance travelled in transporting that horse to the ferry at in Zeebrugge. So it is not entirely going to be free from complexity, despite the snapshot on exit day. Further, there will be reduced access to EU-wide systems such as EU refund system, the tour operator margin scheme, and certain VAT systems, and of course the EU MIDI one-stop shop. Northern Ireland, the VAT position, just as the customs position, remains unclear. Turning customs, well, the UK will be outside the customs union, will no longer apply the EU common customs tariffs on imports. Free circulation of goods between the UK and the EU will end. Goods moving between the UK and EU will mean that customs and excise will be applied as if it were a supply between UK and a non-EU country. Import and export declarations will therefore be required for these transactions, as will safety and security declarations on such transactions. Imports from the EU on excise goods, the excise movement control system will cease to control suspended movements between the EU and the UK, and therefore, in order to avoid excise being immediately payable on import, advice needs to be taken as to how these movements should be made within the UK. Exports to the EU, well, the EU will require duty to be payable on those at the border, and they'll be payable at the rates within the common customs tariff. Imports from the EU to the UK will be subject to UK customs rates. The amount of those rates is set out in the EU common customs tariff, and the UK would be treated as a most favoured nation in those tariffs. The UK rates, on the other hand, have not yet been published, but under the World Trade Organization rules, we understand that they would be non-preferential rules of origin, and the EU would be treated as a most favoured nation. The Northern Irish position is entirely unclear. And what will the impact be for royalties, interest, savings and dividends? Well, currently the obligation of a payer of royalties, interest and dividends is to deduct tax at source under national legislation and in line with the relevant double tax agreements between the various member states and the UK. That is overlaid by the EU Interest and Royalties Directive and the Parent Subsidiary Directive, where interest, royalties and dividends are being paid between associated companies, very broadly, companies within the same group of companies and same ownership, or between a company and its permanent establishment of that company located in one of the EU member states. Those directives exempt withholding tax from interest, royalties, savings and dividends between associated companies and permanent establishments. But on exit day, these directives shall cease to apply in the UK, and therefore the UK and the law of the relevant EU member state will dictate whether any tax must be withheld from those payments. Each country in the EU has a double tax agreement with the UK, including Switzerland. And it is to these agreements that we will need to look to assess whether the withholding tax obligation exists, and also the rate at which that tax withholding must be calculated. The combination of the UK-EU legislation and the double tax agreements may actually result in no change at all. So, for instance, a payment of royalties from the UK to France, to Germany or to Spain would be exactly the same, irrespective of the EU Interest and Royalties Directive. But in other respects, they may change. So, for instance, a payment of a dividend from Germany to a UK company would not be entirely exempt from withholding tax as it would be now by virtue of the content of the UK-German double taxation agreement. So that brings us to an end of this overview as to the impact on UK taxation of Brexit. It is very much an overview, and the advice must be that in dealing with VAT and customs on imports, exports, the provision of services, etc., tax advice will need to be taken both in the UK and it is likely in each member state. It was going to add to the cost of doing business in the EU and between the UK and the EU. And whilst VAT is generally fairly well known and understood by taxpayers, it is often the case that customs duties and excise duties are not as well understood, and it is in that area that we suspect that most advice is going to be needed by our client base. Thank you for listening.